Lyndon Baines Johnson August 27, 1908 January 22, 1973, often referred to as LBJ, was an American politician who served as the 36th President of the United States from 1963 to 1969, assuming the office after serving as the 37th Vice President of the United States from 1961 to 1963. A Democrat from Texas, he also served as a United States Representative and as the Majority Leader in the United States Senate. Johnson is one of only 4 people who have served in all 4 federal elected positions. Born in a farmhouse in Stonewall, Texas, Johnson was a high school teacher and worked as a congressional aide before winning election to the House of Representatives in 1937. He won election to the Senate in 1948, and was appointed the position of Senate Majority Whip in 1951. He became the Senate Minority Leader in 1953 and the Senate Majority Leader in 1955. As a leader in the Senate, Johnson became known for his domineering personality and the Johnson treatment, his aggressive coercion of powerful politicians to advance legislation. Johnson ran for the Democratic nomination in the 1960 presidential election. Although unsuccessful, he accepted the invitation of then-Senator John F. Kennedy of Massachusetts to be his running mate. They went on to win a close election over the Republican ticket of Richard Nixon and Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., and Johnson was sworn in as Vice President on January 20, 1961. On November 22, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, and Johnson succeeded Kennedy as president. The following year, Johnson won a landslide in 1964, defeating Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. In domestic policy, Johnson designed the Great Society legislation by expanding civil rights, public broadcasting, Medicare, Medicaid, aid to education, the arts, urban and rural development, public services, and his war on poverty. Assisted in part by a growing economy, the war on poverty helped millions of Americans rise above the poverty line during his administration. Civil rights bills that he signed into law banned racial discrimination in public facilities, interstate commerce, the workplace, and housing. The Voting Rights Act prohibited certain requirements in southern states used to disenfranchise African Americans. With the passage of the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, the country's immigration system was reformed, encouraging greater immigration from regions other than Europe. Johnson's presidency marked the peak of modern liberalism after the New Deal era. In foreign policy, Johnson escalated American involvement in the Vietnam War. In 1964, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which granted Johnson the power to use military force in Southeast Asia without having to ask for an official declaration of war. The number of American military personnel in Vietnam increased dramatically, from 16,000 advisors in non-combat roles in 1963 to 525,000 in 1967, many in combat roles. American casualties soared and the peace process bogged down. Growing unease with the war stimulated a large, angry anti-war movement based especially on university campuses. Johnson faced further troubles when summer riots broke out in most major cities after 1965, and crime rates soared, as his opponents raised demands for law and order policies. While he began his presidency with widespread approval, support for Johnson declined as the public became upset with both the war and the growing violence at home. In 1968, the Democratic Party factionalized as anti-war elements denounced Johnson. He ended his bid for renomination after a disappointing finish in the New Hampshire primary. Nixon was elected to succeed him, as the New Deal coalition that had dominated presidential politics for 36 years collapsed. After he left office in January 1969, Johnson returned to his Texas ranch, where he died of a heart attack at age 64 on January 22, 1973. Johnson is ranked favorably by many historians because of his domestic policies and the passage of many major laws that affected civil rights, gun control, wilderness preservation, and social security, although he has also drawn substantial criticism for his handling of the Vietnam War. Early years. Lyndon Baines Johnson was born on August 27, 1908, near Stonewall, Texas, in a small farmhouse on the Pedernales River. He was the oldest of 5 children born to Samuel Ely Johnson, Jr., 1877–1937, and Rebecca Baines, 1881–1958. Johnson had one brother, Sam Houston Johnson, 1914–78, and 3 sisters, Rebecca, 1910–78, Josepha, 1912–61, and Lucia, 1916–97. The nearby small town of Johnson City, Texas, was named after LBJ's cousin, James Polk Johnson, whose forebears had moved west from Georgia. Johnson had English, German, and Ulster Scots ancestry. His patrilineal descent traces back to John Johnson, born in Dumfries Shire, Scotland in 1590. He was maternally descended from pioneer Baptist clergyman George Washington Baines, who pastored 8 churches in Texas, as well as others in Arkansas and Louisiana. Baines, the grandfather of Johnson's mother, was also the president of Baylor University during the American Civil War. Johnson's grandfather, Samuel Ely Johnson Sr., was raised as a Baptist, and for a time was a member of the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ. In his later years the grandfather became a Christadelphian. Johnson's father also joined the Christadelphian Church toward the end of his life. Later, as a politician, Johnson was influenced in his positive attitude toward Jews by the religious beliefs that his family, especially his grandfather, had shared with him. See Operation Texas. Johnson's favorite Bible verse came from the King James Version of Isaiah 1:18. Come now, and let us reason together. In school, Johnson was an awkward, talkative youth and was elected president of his 11th grade class. He graduated in 1924 from Johnson City High School, where he participated in public speaking, debate, and baseball. At age 15, Johnson was the youngest member of his class. Pressured by his parents to attend college, he enrolled at a sub-college of Southwest Texas State Teachers College, SWTSTC, in the summer of 1924, where students from unaccredited high schools could take the 12th grade courses needed for admission to college. He left the school just weeks after his arrival, and decided to move to Southern California. He worked at his cousin's legal practice and in various odd jobs before returning to Texas, where he worked as a day laborer. In 1926, Johnson managed to enroll at SWTSTC, now Texas State University. He worked his way through school, participated in debate and campus politics, and edited the school newspaper, The College Star. The college years refined his skills of persuasion and political organization. For 9 months, from 1928 to 1929, Johnson paused his studies to teach Mexican-American children at the segregated Wellhausen School in Cotulla, some 90 miles, 140 kilometers, south of San Antonio in La Salle County. The job helped him to save money to complete his education, and he graduated in 1930. He briefly taught at Pearsall High School before taking a position as teacher of public speaking at Sam Houston High School in Houston. When he returned to San Marcos in 1965, after signing the Higher Education Act of 1965, Johnson reminisced. I shall never forget the faces of the boys and the girls in that little Wellhausen Mexican school, and I remember even yet the pain of realizing and knowing then that college was closed to practically every one of those children because they were too poor. And I think it was then that I made up my mind that this nation could never rest while the door to knowledge remained closed to any American. Entry into politics. After Richard M. Kleberg won a 1931 special election to represent Texas in the United States House of Representatives, he appointed Johnson as his legislative secretary. Johnson got the position on the recommendation of his own father and that of State Senator Welly Hopkins, who Johnson had campaigned for in 1930. Kleberg had little interest in performing the day-to-day duties of a congressman, instead delegating them to Johnson. After Franklin D. Roosevelt won the 1932 presidential election, Johnson became a staunch supporter of Roosevelt's New Deal. Johnson was elected Speaker of the Little Congress, a group of congressional aides, where he cultivated congressmen, newspapermen, and lobbyists. Johnson's friends soon included aides to President Roosevelt as well as fellow Texans such as Vice President John Nance Garner and Congressman Sam Rayburn. Johnson married Claudia Alta Taylor, also known as Lady Bird, of Karnak, Texas on November 17, 1934, after he attended Georgetown University Law Center for several months. The wedding was officiated by Reverend Arthur R. McKinstry at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in San Antonio. They had two daughters, Linda Bird, born in 1944, and Lucy Baines, born in 1947. Johnson gave his children names with the LBJ initials. His dog was Little Beagle Johnson. His was the LBJ Ranch. His initials were on his cufflinks, ashtrays, and clothes. In 1935, he was appointed head of the Texas National Youth Administration, which enabled him to use the government to create education and job opportunities for young people. He resigned 2 years later to run for Congress. Johnson, a notoriously tough boss throughout his career, often demanded long workdays and work on weekends. He was described by friends, fellow politicians, and historians as motivated by an exceptional lust for power and control. As Johnson's biographer Robert Caro observes, Johnson's ambition was uncommon in the degree to which it was unencumbered by even the slightest excess weight of ideology, of philosophy, of principles, of beliefs. Career in U.S. House of Representatives, 1937–49. In 1937, Johnson successfully campaigned in a special election for Texas's 10th congressional district, that covered Austin and the surrounding hill country. He ran on a New Deal platform and was effectively aided by his wife. He served in the House from April 10, 1937, to January 3, 1949. President Franklin D. Roosevelt found Johnson to be a welcome ally and conduit for information, particularly with regard to issues concerning internal politics in Texas, Operation Texas, and the machinations of Vice President John Nance Garner and Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn. Johnson was immediately appointed to the Naval Affairs Committee. He worked for rural electrification and other improvements for his district. Johnson steered the projects towards contractors that he personally knew, such as the Brown brothers, Herman and George, who would finance much of Johnson's future career. In 1941, he ran for the Democratic U.S. Senate nomination in a special election. His main opponent was the sitting governor of Texas, businessman and radio personality W. Lee O'Daniel. Johnson narrowly lost the Democratic primary, which was then tantamount to election, with O'Daniel receiving 175,590 votes, 30.49%, and Johnson 174,279, 30.26%. Active military duty, 1941–42. Johnson was appointed a lieutenant commander in the U.S. Naval Reserve on June 21, 1940. While serving as a U.S. congressman, he was called to active duty 3 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. His orders were to report to the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, D.C. for instruction and training. Following his training, he asked Under-Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal for a combat assignment. He was sent instead to inspect the shipyard facilities in Texas and on the West Coast. In the spring of 1942, President Roosevelt needed his own reports on what conditions were like in the Southwest Pacific. Roosevelt felt that information which flowed up the military chain of command needed to get delivered by a highly trusted political aide. From a suggestion by Forrestal, Roosevelt assigned Johnson to a three-man survey team of the Southwest Pacific. Johnson reported to General Douglas MacArthur in Australia. Johnson and 2 U.S. Army officers went to the 22nd Bomb Group base, which was assigned the high-risk mission of bombing the Japanese airbase at Lae in New Guinea. Johnson's roommate was an Army second lieutenant who was a B-17 bomber pilot. On June 9, 1942, Johnson volunteered as an observer for an airstrike mission on New Guinea by 11 B-26 bombers that included his roommate in another plane. While on the mission, his roommate and his crew's B-26 bomber was shot down with none of the 8 men surviving the crash into the water. Reports vary on what happened to the B-26 bomber carrying Johnson during that mission. Johnson's biographer Robert Caro accepts Johnson's account, and supports it with testimony from the aircrew concerned. The aircraft was attacked, disabling one engine, and it turned back before reaching its objective, though remaining under heavy fire. Others claim that it turned back because of generator trouble before reaching the objective and before encountering enemy aircraft and never came under fire. This is said to be supported by official flight records. Other airplanes that continued to the target came under fire near the target at about the same time that Johnson's plane was recorded as having landed back at the original airbase. MacArthur recommended Johnson for the Silver Star for gallantry in action. After it was approved by the Army, he personally presented the medal to Johnson, with the following citation. For gallantry in action in the vicinity of Port Moresby and Salam Allah, New Guinea, on June 9, 1942. While on a mission of obtaining information in the Southwest Pacific area, Lieutenant Commander Johnson, in order to obtain personal knowledge of combat conditions, volunteered as an observer on a hazardous aerial combat mission over hostile positions in New Guinea. As our planes neared the target area, they were intercepted by 8 hostile fighters. When, at this time, the plane in which Lieutenant Commander Johnson was an observer, developed mechanical trouble and was forced to turn back alone, presenting a favorable target to the enemy fighters, he evidenced marked coolness in spite of the hazards involved. His gallant actions enabled him to obtain and return with valuable information. Johnson, who had used a camera as an observer, reported to Roosevelt, to the Navy leaders, and to Congress that conditions were deplorable and unacceptable. He argued that the Southwest Pacific urgently needed a higher priority and a larger share of war supplies. The warplanes sent there, for example, were far inferior to Japanese planes, and morale was bad. He told Forrestal that the Pacific Fleet had a critical need for 6,800 additional experienced men. Johnson prepared a 12-point program to upgrade the effort in the region, stressing greater cooperation and coordination within the various commands and between the different war theaters. Congress responded by making Johnson chairman of a high-powered subcommittee of the Naval Affairs Committee, with a mission similar to that of the Truman Committee in the Senate. He probed the peacetime business-as-usual inefficiencies that permeated the naval war and demanded that admirals shape up and get the job done. Johnson went too far when he proposed a bill that would crack down on the draft exemptions of shipyard workers if they were absent from work too often. Organized labor blocked the bill and denounced him. Johnson's biographer, Robert Dallek, concludes, the mission was a temporary exposure to danger calculated to satisfy Johnson's personal and political wishes, but it also represented a genuine effort on his part, however misplaced, to improve the lot of America's fighting men. In addition to the Silver Star, Johnson received the American Campaign Medal, Asiatic Pacific Campaign Medal, and the World War II Victory Medal. He was released from active duty on July 17, 1942 and remained in the Navy Reserve, later promoted to commander on October 19, 1949, effective June 2, 1948. He resigned from the Navy Reserve effective January 18, 1964. Career in U.S. Senate, 1949–61. Contested 1948 election. In the 1948 elections, Johnson again ran for the Senate and won in a highly controversial result in a three-way Democratic Party primary. Johnson faced a well-known former governor, Coke Stevenson, and George Petty, a former state representative of District 8 in Shelby County. Johnson drew crowds to fairgrounds with his rented helicopter dubbed the Johnson City Windmill. He raised money to flood the state with campaign circulars and won over conservatives by voting for the Taft-Hartley Act, curbing union power, as well as by criticizing unions. Stevenson came in first but lacked a majority, so a runoff was held. Johnson campaigned even harder, while Stevenson's efforts slumped. The runoff count took a week, handled by the Democratic State Central Committee, because this was a party primary. Johnson was finally announced the winner by 87 votes out of 988,295 cast. The committee voted to certify Johnson's nomination by a majority of 29-28, with the last vote cast on Johnson's behalf by Temple, Texas, publisher Frank W. Mayborn. There were many allegations of voter fraud. One writer alleges that Johnson's campaign manager, future Texas Governor John B. Connally, was connected with 202 ballots in Precinct 13 in Jim Wells County where the names had curiously been listed in alphabetical order with the same pen and handwriting, just at the close of polling. Some of these voters insisted that they had not voted that day. Robert Caro argued in his 1989 book that Johnson had thus stolen the election in Jim Wells County, and that 10,000 ballots were also rigged in Behar County alone. Election Judge Luis Salas said in 1977 that he had certified 202 fraudulent ballots for Johnson. The state Democratic Convention upheld Johnson. Stevenson went to court, but Johnson prevailed with timely help from his friend Abe Fortas. He soundly defeated Republican Jack Porter in the general election in November and went to Washington, permanently dubbed Landslide Lyndon. Johnson, dismissive of his critics, happily adopted the nickname freshman senator to majority whip. Once in the Senate, Johnson was known among his colleagues for his highly successful courtships of older senators, especially Senator Richard Russell, Democrat from Georgia, the leader of the conservative coalition and arguably the most powerful man in the Senate. Johnson proceeded to gain Russell's favor in the same way that he had courted Speaker Sam Rayburn and gained his crucial support in the House. Johnson was appointed to the Senate Armed Services Committee, and later in 1950, he helped create the Preparedness Investigating Subcommittee. Johnson became its chairman and conducted investigations of defense costs and efficiency. These investigations revealed old investigations and demanded actions that were already being taken in part by the Truman administration, although it can be said that the committee's investigations reinforced the need for changes. Johnson gained headlines and national attention through his handling of the press, the efficiency with which his committee issued new reports, and the fact that he ensured that every report was endorsed unanimously by the committee. Johnson used his political influence in the Senate to receive broadcast licenses from the Federal Communications Commission in his wife's name. After the 1950 general elections, Johnson was chosen as Senate Majority Whip in 1951 under the new Majority Leader, Ernest McFarland of Arizona, and served from 1951 to 1953. Senate Democratic Leader. In the 1952 general election, Republicans won a majority in both the House and Senate. Among defeated Democrats that year was McFarland, who lost to upstart Barry Goldwater. In January 1953, Johnson was chosen by his fellow Democrats to be the minority leader. He became the most junior senator ever elected to this position. One of his first actions was to eliminate the seniority system in making appointments to committees, while retaining it for chairmanships. In the 1954 election, Johnson was re-elected to the Senate, and since the Democrats won the majority in the Senate, Johnson then became Majority Leader. Former Majority Leader William Knowland became Minority Leader. Johnson's duties were to schedule legislation and help pass measures favored by the Democrats. Johnson, Rayburn, and President Dwight D. Eisenhower worked well together in passing Eisenhower's domestic and foreign agenda. During the Suez Crisis, Johnson tried to prevent the U.S. government from criticizing the Israeli invasion of the Sinai Peninsula. Along with the rest of the nation, Johnson was appalled by the threat of possible Soviet domination of spaceflight implied by the launch of the first artificial Earth satellite Sputnik 1, and used his influence to ensure passage of the 1958 National Aeronautics and Space Act, which established the civilian space agency NASA. Historians Caro and Dollop consider Lyndon Johnson the most effective Senate Majority Leader in history. He was unusually proficient at gathering information. One biographer suggests he was the greatest intelligence gatherer Washington has ever known, discovering exactly where every senator stood on issues, his philosophy and prejudices, his strengths and weaknesses, and what it took to get his vote. Robert Baker claimed that Johnson would occasionally send senators on NATO trips in order to avoid their dissenting votes. Central to Johnson's control was the treatment, described by two journalists. The treatment could last 10 minutes or 4 hours. It came, enveloping its target, at the Johnson Ranch swimming pool, in one of Johnson's offices, in the Senate cloakroom, on the floor of the Senate itself, wherever Johnson might find a fellow senator within his reach. Its tone could be supplication, accusation, cajolery, exuberance, scorn, tears, complaint, and the hint of threat. It was all of these together. It ran the gamut of human emotions. Its velocity was breathtaking, and it was all in one direction. Interjections from the target were rare. Johnson anticipated them before they could be spoken. He moved in close, his face a scant millimeter from his target, his eyes widening and narrowing, his eyebrows rising and falling. From his pockets poured clippings, memos, statistics. Mimicry, humor, and the genius of analogy made the treatment an almost hypnotic experience and rendered the target stunned and helpless. A 60 cigarette per day smoker, Johnson suffered a near-fatal heart attack on July 2, 1955. He abruptly gave up smoking as a result, with only a couple of exceptions, and did not resume the habit until he left the White House on January 20, 1969. Campaigns of 1960. Johnson's success in the Senate rendered him a potential Democratic presidential candidate. He had been the favorite son candidate of the Texas delegation at the party's national convention in 1956, and appeared to be in a strong position to run for the 1960 nomination. Jim Rowe repeatedly urged Johnson to launch a campaign in early 1959, but Johnson thought it better to wait, thinking that John Kennedy's efforts would create a division in the ranks which could then be exploited. Rowe finally joined the Humphrey campaign in frustration, another move which Johnson thought played into his own strategy. Candidacy for president. Johnson made a late entry into the campaign in July 1960 which, coupled with a reluctance to leave Washington, allowed the rival Kennedy campaign to secure a substantial early advantage among Democratic state party officials. Johnson underestimated Kennedy's endearing qualities of charm and intelligence, as compared to his own reputation as the more crude and wheeling-dealing landslide Lyndon. Caro suggests that Johnson's hesitancy was the result of an overwhelming fear of failure. Johnson attempted in vain to capitalize on Kennedy's youth, poor health, and failure to take a position regarding Joseph McCarthy. He had formed a Stop Kennedy coalition with Adlai Stevenson, Stuart Symington, and Hubert Humphrey, but it proved a failure. Johnson received 409 votes on the only ballot at the Democratic Convention to Kennedy's 806, and so the convention nominated Kennedy. Tip O'Neill was a representative from Kennedy's home state of Massachusetts at that time, and he recalled that Johnson approached him at the convention and said, "Tip, I know you have to support Kennedy at the start, but I'd like to have you with me on the second ballot." O'Neill replied, "Senator, there's not going to be any second ballot." Vice presidential nomination. According to Kennedy's special counsel Meyer Feldman and to Kennedy himself, it is impossible to reconstruct the precise manner in which Johnson's vice presidential nomination ultimately took place. Kennedy did realize that he could not be elected without support of traditional Southern Democrats, most of whom had backed Johnson. Nevertheless, labor leaders were unanimous in their opposition to Johnson. After much back and forth with party leaders and others on the matter, Kennedy did offer Johnson the vice presidential nomination at the Los Angeles Biltmore Hotel at 10:15 a.m. on July 14, the morning after he was nominated, and Johnson accepted. From that point to the actual nomination that evening, the facts are in dispute in many respects. Convention Chairman Leroy Collins' declaration of a two-thirds majority in favor by voice vote is even disputed. Seymour Hersh stated that Robert F. Kennedy, known as Bobby, hated Johnson for his personal attacks on the Kennedy family, and later maintained that his brother offered the position to Johnson merely as a courtesy, expecting him to decline. Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. concurred with Robert Kennedy's version of events, and put forth that John Kennedy would have preferred Stuart Symington as his running mate, alleging that Johnson teamed with House Speaker Sam Rayburn and pressured Kennedy to favor Johnson. Biographer Robert Caro offered a different perspective. He wrote that the Kennedy campaign was desperate to win what was forecast to be a very close election against Richard Nixon and Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. Johnson was needed on the ticket to help carry Texas and the southern states. Caro's research showed that on July 14, John Kennedy started the process while Johnson was still asleep. At 6:30 a.m., John Kennedy asked Robert Kennedy to prepare an estimate of upcoming electoral votes including Texas. Robert called Pierre Salinger and Kenneth O'Donnell to assist him. Salinger realized the ramifications of counting Texas votes as their own, and asked him whether he was considering a Kennedy-Johnson ticket, and Robert replied yes. Caro contends that it was then that John Kennedy called Johnson to arrange a meeting. He also called Pennsylvania Governor David L. Lawrence, a Johnson backer, to request that he nominate Johnson for vice president if Johnson were to accept the role. According to Caro, Kennedy and Johnson met and Johnson said that Kennedy would have trouble with Kennedy supporters who were anti-Johnson. Kennedy returned to his suite to announce the Kennedy-Johnson ticket to his closest supporters, including Northern political bosses. O'Donnell was angry at what he considered a betrayal by Kennedy, who had previously cast Johnson as anti-labor and anti-liberal. Afterward, Robert Kennedy visited labor leaders who were extremely unhappy with the choice of Johnson and, after seeing the depth of labor opposition to Johnson, Robert ran messages between the hotel suites of his brother and Johnson apparently trying to undermine the proposed ticket without John Kennedy's authorization. Caro continues in his analysis that Robert Kennedy tried to get Johnson to agree to be the Democratic Party chairman rather than vice president. Johnson refused to accept a change in plans unless it came directly from John Kennedy. Despite his brother's interference, John Kennedy was firm that Johnson was who he wanted as running mate. He met with staffers such as Larry O'Brien, his national campaign manager, to say that Johnson was to be vice president. O'Brien recalled later that John Kennedy's words were wholly unexpected, but that after a brief consideration of the electoral vote situation, he thought it was a stroke of genius. When John and Robert Kennedy next saw their father Joe Kennedy, he told them that signing Johnson as running mate was the smartest thing that they had ever done. Re-election to U.S. Senate. At the same time as his vice presidential run, Johnson also sought a third term in the U.S. Senate. According to Robert Caro, on November 8, 1960, Lyndon Johnson won election for both the vice presidency of the United States, on the Kennedy-Johnson ticket, and for a third term as senator. He had Texas law changed to allow him to run for both offices. When he won the vice presidency, he made arrangements to resign from the Senate, as he was required to do under federal law, as soon as it convened on January 3, 1961. In 1988, Lloyd Bentsen, the vice presidential running mate of Democratic presidential candidate Michael Dukakis, and a senator from Texas, took advantage of Lyndon's law, and was able to retain his seat in the Senate despite Dukakis' loss to George H. W. Bush. Johnson was re-elected senator with 1,306,605 votes, 58%, to Republican John Towers' 927,653, 41.1%. Fellow Democrat William A. Blakely was appointed to replace Johnson as senator, but Blakely lost a special election in May 1961 to Tower. Vice Presidency, 1961–63. After the election, Johnson W.A. regarding housing, but this fell on deaf ears. Johnson's popularity plummeted as a massive white political backlash took shape, reinforcing the sense Johnson had lost control of the streets of major cities as well as his party. Johnson created the Kerner Commission to study the problem of urban riots, headed by Illinois Governor Otto Kerner. According to Press Secretary George Christian, Johnson was unsurprised by the riots, saying, "What did you expect? I don't know why we're so surprised. When you put your foot on a man's neck and hold him down for 300 years, and then you let him up, what's he going to do? He's going to knock your block off." Backlash against Johnson, 1966–67. In 1966 the press sensed a credibility gap between what Johnson was saying in press conferences and what was happening on the ground in Vietnam, which led to much less favorable coverage. By year's end, the Democratic governor of Missouri, Warren E. Hines, warned that Johnson would lose the state by 100,000 votes, despite winning by a 500,000 margin in 1964. Frustration over Vietnam, too much federal spending and taxation, no great public support for your Great Society programs, and public disenchantment with the civil rights programs had eroded the president's standing, the governor reported. There were bright spots. In January 1967, Johnson boasted that wages were the highest in history, unemployment was at a 13-year low, and corporate profits and farm incomes were greater than ever. A 4.5% jump in consumer prices was worrisome, as was the rise in interest rates. Johnson asked for a temporary 6% surcharge in income taxes to cover the mounting deficit caused by increased spending. Johnson's approval ratings stayed below 50%. By January 1967, the number of his strong supporters had plunged to 16%, from 25% 4 months before. He ran about even with Republican George Romney in trial matchups that spring. Asked to explain why he was unpopular, Johnson responded, "I am a dominating personality, and when I get things done I don't always please all the people." Johnson also blamed the press, saying they showed complete irresponsibility and lie and misstate facts and have no one to be answerable to. He also blamed the preachers, liberals, and professors who had turned against him. In the congressional elections of 1966, the Republicans gained 3 seats in the Senate and 47 in the House, reinvigorating the conservative coalition and making it more difficult for Johnson to pass any additional Great Society legislation. However, in the end Congress passed almost 96% of the administration's Great Society programs, which Johnson then signed into law. Vietnam War. At Kennedy's death, there were 16,000 American military personnel stationed in Vietnam. These personnel supported South Vietnam in the Vietnam War against North Vietnam. Vietnam had been partitioned at the 1954 Geneva Conference into two countries, with North Vietnam led by a communist government. Johnson subscribed to the domino theory in Vietnam and to a containment policy that required America to make a serious effort to stop all communist expansion. On taking office, Johnson immediately reversed Kennedy's order to withdraw 1,000 military personnel by the end of 1963. In late summer 1964, Johnson seriously questioned the value of staying in Vietnam but, after meeting with Secretary of State Dean Rusk and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Maxwell D. Taylor, declared his readiness to do more when we had a base or when Saigon was politically more stable. He expanded the numbers and roles of the American military following the Gulf of Tonkin incident. 1964. In August 1964, allegations arose from the military that two U.S. destroyers had been attacked by some North Vietnamese torpedo boats in international waters 40 miles, 64 kilometers, from the Vietnamese coast in the Gulf of Tonkin. Naval communications and reports of the attack were contradictory. Although Johnson very much wanted to keep discussions about Vietnam out of the 1964 election campaign, he felt forced to respond to the supposed aggression by the Vietnamese, so he sought and obtained from the Congress the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution on August 7. Johnson, determined to embolden his image on foreign policy, also wanted to prevent criticism such as Truman had received in Korea by proceeding without congressional endorsement of military action. A response to the purported attack as well blunted presidential campaign criticism of weakness from the hawkish Goldwater camp. The resolution gave congressional approval for use of military force by the Commander-in-Chief to repel future attacks and also to assist members of SEATO requesting assistance. Johnson later in the campaign expressed assurance that the primary U.S. goal remained the preservation of South Vietnamese independence through material and advice, as opposed to any U.S. offensive posture. The public's reaction to the resolution at the time was positive. 48% favored stronger measures in Vietnam and only 14% wanted to negotiate a settlement and leave. In the 1964 presidential campaign, Johnson restated his determination to provide measured support for Vietnam while avoiding another Korea, but privately he had a sense of foreboding about Vietnam, a feeling that no matter what he did things would end badly. Indeed, his heart was on his Great Society agenda, and he even felt that his political opponents favored greater intervention in Vietnam in order to divert attention and resources away from his war on poverty. The situation on the ground was aggravated in the fall by additional Viet Minh attacks on U.S. ships in the Tonkin Gulf, as well as an attack on Bien Hoa Air Base in South Vietnam. Johnson decided against retaliatory action at the time after consultation with the Joint Chiefs and also after public pollster Lou Harris confirmed that his decision would not detrimentally affect him at the polls. By the end of 1964, there were approximately 23,000 military personnel in South Vietnam. U.S. casualties for 1964 totaled 1,278. In the winter of 1964-65, Johnson was pressured by the military to begin a bombing campaign to forcefully resist a communist takeover in South Vietnam. Moreover, a plurality in the polls at the time were in favor of military action against the communists, with only 26 to 30% opposed. Johnson revised his priorities, and a new preference for stronger action came at the end of January with yet another change of government in Saigon. He then agreed with Mac Bundy and McNamara that the continued passive role would only lead to defeat and withdrawal and humiliation. Johnson said, "Stable government or no stable government in Saigon, we will do what we ought to do. I'm prepared to do that. We will move strongly." General Nguyen Khan, head of the new government, is our boy. 1965. Johnson decided on a systematic bombing campaign in February after a ground report from Bundy recommending immediate U.S. action to avoid defeat. Also, the Viet Cong had just killed 8 U.S. advisors and wounded dozens of others in an attack at Pleiku Air Base. The 8-week bombing campaign became known as Operation Rolling Thunder. Johnson's instructions for public consumption were clear: there was to be no comment that the war effort had been expanded. Long-term estimates of the bombing campaign ranged from an expectation that Hanoi would rein in the Viet Cong to one of provoking Hanoi and the Viet Cong into an intensification of the war. But the short-term expectations were consistent, that the morale and stability of the South Vietnamese government would be bolstered. By limiting the information given out to the public and even to Congress, Johnson maximized his flexibility to change course. In March, Bundy began to urge the use of ground forces. American air operations alone, he counseled, would not stop Hanoi's aggression against the South. Johnson approved an increase in logistical troops of 18,000 to 20,000, the deployment of 2 additional Marine battalions and a Marine Air Squadron, in addition to planning for the deployment of 2 more divisions, and most importantly a change in mission from defensive to offensive operations. Nevertheless, he disobligingly continued to insist that this was not to be publicly represented as a change in existing policy. By the middle of June, the total U.S. ground forces in Vietnam were increased to 82,000, or by 150%. That same month, Ambassador Taylor reported that the bombing offensive against North Vietnam had been ineffective, and that the South Vietnamese army was outclassed and in danger of collapse. General Westmoreland shortly thereafter recommended the President further increase ground troops from 82,000 to 175,000. After consulting with his principals, Johnson, desirous of a low profile, chose to announce at a press conference an increase to 125,000 troops, with additional forces to be sent later upon request. Johnson described himself at the time as boxed in by unpalatable choices between sending Americans to die in Vietnam and giving in to the Communists. If he sent additional troops, he would be attacked as an interventionist, and if he did not, he thought he risked being impeached. He continued to insist that his decision did not imply any change in policy whatsoever. Of his desire to veil the decision, Johnson jested privately, "If you have a mother-in-law with only one eye, and she has it in the center of her forehead, you don't keep her in the living room." By October 1965 there were over 200,000 troops deployed in Vietnam. 1966. Public as well as political impatience with the war began to emerge in the spring of 1966. At the time, when Johnson's approval ratings were reaching new lows of 41%, Senator Richard Russell, chairman of the Armed Services Committee, reflected the national mood in June 1966, when he declared it was time to get it over or get out. Johnson responded by saying to the press, "We are trying to provide the maximum deterrence that we can to communist aggression with a minimum of cost." In response to the intensified criticism of the war effort, Johnson employed the suspicion of communist subversion in the country, and press relations became strained. Johnson's primary war policy opponent in Congress included among others the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, James William Fulbright. The persistent Johnson began to seriously consider a more focused bombing campaign against petroleum, oil, and lubrication facilities in North Vietnam in hopes of accelerating victory. Humphrey, Rusk, and McNamara all agreed. The bombing began the end of June. In July, polling results indicated that Americans favored the bombing campaign by a 5-to-1 margin. However, in August a Defense Department study indicated that the bombing campaign had little impact on North Vietnam. In the fall of 1966, however, multiple sources began to report progress was being made against the North Vietnamese logistics and infrastructure. Johnson was urged from every corner to begin peace discussions. There was no shortage of peace initiatives. Nevertheless, among protesters, English philosopher Bertrand Russell attacked Johnson's policy as a barbaric aggressive war of conquest, and in June he initiated the International War Crimes Tribunal as a means to condemn the American effort. The gap with Hanoi was an unbridgeable demand on both sides for a unilateral end to bombing and withdrawal of forces. In August, Johnson appointed Averell Harriman ambassador for peace to promote negotiations. Westmoreland and McNamara then recommended a concerted program to promote pacification. Johnson formally placed this effort under military control in October. Also in October 1966, to reassure and promote his war effort, Johnson initiated a meeting with allies in Manila: the South Vietnamese, Thais, South Koreans, Filipinos, Australians and New Zealanders. The conference ended with pronouncements to stand fast against communist aggression and to promote ideals of democracy and development in Vietnam and across Asia. For Johnson it was a fleeting public relations success confirmed by a 63% Vietnam approval rating in November. Nevertheless, in December Johnson's Vietnam approval rating was again back down in the 40s. LBJ had become anxious to justify war casualties, and talked of the need for decisive victory, despite the unpopularity of the cause. In a discussion about the war with former President Dwight Eisenhower on October 3, 1966, Johnson said he was trying to win it just as fast as I can in every way that I know how, and later stated that he needed all the help I can get. By year's end it was clear that current pacification efforts were ineffectual, as had been the air campaign. Johnson then agreed to McNamara's new recommendation to add 70,000 troops in 1967 to the 400,000 previously committed. While McNamara recommended no increase in the level of bombing, Johnson agreed with CIA recommendations to increase them. The increased bombing began despite initial secret talks being held in Saigon, Hanoi, and Warsaw. While the bombing ended the talks, North Vietnamese intentions were not considered genuine. 1967. January and February 1967 included probes to detect North Vietnamese willingness to discuss peace, and all fell on deaf ears. Ho Chi Minh declared that the only solution was a unilateral withdrawal by the U.S. A Gallup poll taken in July 1967 showed 52% of the country disapproving of the president's handling of the war and only 34% thought progress was being made. Johnson's anger and frustration over the lack of a solution to Vietnam and its effect on him politically was exhibited in a statement to Robert F. Kennedy, who had become a prominent public critic of the war and loomed as a potential challenger in the 1968 presidential election. Johnson had just received several reports predicting military progress by the summer, and warned Kennedy, "I'll destroy you and every one of your Dove friends in 6 months," he shouted. "You'll be dead politically in 6 months." McNamara offered Johnson a way out of Vietnam in May. The administration could declare its objective in the war. South Vietnam's self-determination was being achieved, and upcoming September elections in South Vietnam would provide the chance for a coalition government. The United States could reasonably expect that country to then assume responsibility for the election outcome. But Johnson was reluctant, in light of some optimistic reports, again of questionable reliability, which matched the negative assessments about the conflict and provided hope of improvement. The CIA was reporting wide food shortages in Hanoi and an unstable power grid, as well as military manpower reductions. By the middle of 1967 nearly 70,000 Americans had been killed or wounded in the war. In July, Johnson sent McNamara, Wheeler, and other officials to meet with Westmoreland and reach agreement on plans for the immediate future. At that time the war was being commonly described by the press and others as a stalemate. Westmoreland said such a description was pure fiction, and that we are winning slowly but steadily and the pace can excel if we reinforce our successes. Though Westmoreland sought many more, Johnson agreed to an increase of 55,000 troops, bringing the total to 525,000. In August Johnson, with the Joint Chiefs' support, decided to expand the air campaign and exempted only Hanoi, Haiphong, and a buffer zone with China from the target list. In September, Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnamese Premier Pham Van Dong appeared amenable to French mediation, so Johnson ceased bombing in a 10-mile zone around Hanoi. This was met with dissatisfaction. Johnson in a Texas speech agreed to halt all bombing if Ho Chi Minh would launch productive and meaningful discussions and if North Vietnam would not seek to take advantage of the halt. This was named the San Antonio Formula. There was no response, but Johnson pursued the possibility of negotiations with such a bombing pause. With the war still arguably in a stalemate and in light of the widespread disapproval of the conflict, Johnson convened a group called the Wise Men for a fresh, in-depth look at the war. Dean Acheson, General Omar Bradley, George Ball, Mac Bundy, Arthur Dean, Douglas Dillon, Abe Fortas, Averell Harriman, Henry Cabot Lodge, Robert Murphy, and Max Taylor. At that time, McNamara, reversing his position on the war, recommended that a cap of 525,000 be placed on the number of forces deployed and that the bombing be halted, since he could see no success. Johnson was quite agitated by this recommendation and McNamara's resignation soon followed. With the exception of George Ball, the Wise Men all agreed the administration should press forward. Johnson was confident that Hanoi would await the 1968 U.S. election results before deciding to negotiate. On June 23, 1967, Johnson traveled to Los Angeles for a Democratic fundraiser. Thousands of anti-war protesters tried to march past the hotel where he was speaking. The march was led by a coalition of peace protesters. However, a small group of Progressive Labor Party and SDS protesters activists placed themselves at the head of the march and, when they reached the hotel, staged a sit-down. Efforts by march monitors to keep the main body of the marchers moving were only partially successful. Hundreds of LAPD officers were massed at the hotel, and when the march slowed, an order was given to disperse the crowd. The Riot Act was read and 51 protesters arrested. This was one of the first massive war protests in the United States and the first in Los Angeles. Ending in a clash with riot police, it set a pattern for the massive protests which followed. Due to the size and violence of this event, Johnson attempted no further public speeches in venues outside military bases. With the ever-increasing public protests against the war, in October Johnson engaged the FBI and the CIA to investigate, monitor, and undermine anti-war activists. In mid-October there was a demonstration of 100,000 at the Pentagon. Johnson and Rusk were convinced that foreign communist sources were behind the demonstration, which was refuted by CIA findings. 1968. As casualties mounted and success seemed further away than ever, Johnson's popularity plummeted. College students and others protested, burned draft cards, and chanted, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Johnson could scarcely travel anywhere without facing protests, and was not allowed by the Secret Service to attend the 1968 Democratic National Convention, where thousands of hippies, yippies, Black Panthers, and other opponents of Johnson's policies both in Vietnam and in the ghettos converged to protest. Thus by 1968, the public was polarized, with the Hawks rejecting Johnson's refusal to continue the war indefinitely, and the Doves rejecting his current war policies. Support for Johnson's middle position continued to shrink until he finally rejected containment and sought a peace settlement. By late summer, he realized that Nixon was closer to his position than Humphrey. He continued to support Humphrey publicly in the election, and personally despised Nixon. One of Johnson's well-known quotes was, "The Democratic Party at its worst is still better than the Republican Party at its best." On January 30 came the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Tet Offensive against South Vietnam's 5 largest cities, including Saigon and the U.S. Embassy there and other government installations. While the Tet Offensive failed militarily, it was a psychological victory, definitively turning American public opinion against the war effort. Iconically, Walter Cronkite of CBS News, voted the nation's most trusted person in February, expressed on the air that the conflict was deadlocked and that additional fighting would change nothing. Johnson reacted, saying, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Indeed, demoralization about the war was everywhere. 26% then approved of Johnson's handling of Vietnam, 63% disapproved. Johnson agreed to increase the troop level by 22,000, despite a recommendation from the Joint Chiefs for 10 times that number. By March 1968, Johnson was secretly desperate for an honorable way out of the war. Clark Clifford, the new Defense Secretary, described the war as a loser and proposed to cut losses and get out. On March 31, Johnson spoke to the nation of steps to limit the war in Vietnam. He then announced an immediate unilateral halt to the bombing of North Vietnam and announced his intention to seek out peace talks anywhere at any time. At the close of his speech he also announced, "I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president." In March, Johnson decided to restrict future bombing, with the result that 90% of North Vietnam's population and 75% of its territory was off-limits to bombing. In April he succeeded in opening discussions of peace talks, and after extensive negotiations over the site, Paris was agreed to and talks began in May. When the talks failed to yield any results, the decision was made to resort to private discussions in Paris. 2 months later it was apparent that private discussions proved to be no more productive. Despite recommendations in August from Harriman, Vance, Clifford, and Bundy to halt bombing as an incentive for Hanoi to seriously engage in substantive peace talks, Johnson refused. In October, when the parties came close to an agreement on a bombing halt, Republican presidential nominee Richard Nixon intervened with the South Vietnamese, and made promises of better terms, so as to delay a settlement on the issue until after the election. After the election, Johnson's primary focus on Vietnam was to get Saigon to join the Paris peace talks. Ironically, only after Nixon added his urging did they do so. Even then they argued about procedural matters until after Nixon took office. The Six-Day War and Israel. In a 1993 interview for the Johnson Presidential Library Oral History Archives, Johnson's Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara stated that a carrier battle group, the U.S. Sixth Fleet, sent on a training exercise toward Gibraltar was repositioned back towards the eastern Mediterranean to be able to assist Israel during the Six-Day War of June 1967. Given the rapid Israeli advances following their strike on Egypt, the administration thought the situation was so tense in Israel that perhaps the Syrians, fearing Israel would attack them, or the Soviets supporting the Syrians might wish to redress the balance of power and might attack Israel. The Soviets learned of this course correction and regarded it as an offensive move. In a hotline message from Moscow, Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin said, "If you want war, you're going to get war." The Soviet Union supported its Arab allies. In May 1967, the Soviets started a surge deployment of their naval forces into the East Mediterranean. Early in the crisis they began to shadow the US and British carriers with destroyers and intelligence-collecting vessels. The Soviet naval squadron in the Mediterranean was sufficiently strong to act as a major restraint on the US Navy. In a 1983 interview with the Boston Globe, McNamara claimed that we damn near had war. He said Kosygin was angry that we had turned around a carrier in the Mediterranean. Surveillance of Martin Luther King. Johnson continued the FBI's wiretapping of Martin Luther King Jr. that had been previously authorized by the Kennedy administration under Attorney General Robert Kennedy. As a result of listening to the FBI's tapes, remarks on King's extramarital activities were made by several prominent officials, including Johnson, who once said that King was a hypocritical preacher. Johnson also authorized the tapping of phone conversations of others, including the Vietnamese friends of a Nixon associate. International trips. Johnson made 11 international trips to 20 countries during his presidency. He flew 523,000 miles aboard Air Force One while in office. His October 1966 visit to Australia sparked demonstrations from anti-war protesters. One of the most unusual international trips in presidential history occurred before Christmas in 1967. The president began the trip by going to the memorial service for Australian Prime Minister Harold Holt, who had disappeared in a swimming accident and was presumed drowned. The White House did not reveal in advance to the press that the president would make the first round-the-world presidential trip. The trip was 26,959 miles completed in only 112.5 hours, 4.7 days. Air Force One crossed the equator twice, stopped in Travis Air Force Base, California, then Honolulu, Pago Pago, Canberra, Melbourne, Vietnam, Karachi, and Rome. 1968 presidential election. As he had served less than 24 months of President Kennedy's term, Johnson was constitutionally permitted to run for a second full term in the 1968 presidential election under the provisions of the 22nd Amendment. Initially, no prominent Democratic candidate was prepared to run against a sitting president of the Democratic Party. Only Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota challenged Johnson as an anti-war candidate in the New Hampshire primary, hoping to pressure the Democrats to oppose the Vietnam War. On March 12, McCarthy won 42% of the primary vote to Johnson's 49%, an amazingly strong showing for such a challenger. 4 days later, Senator Robert F. Kennedy of New York entered the race. Internal polling by Johnson's campaign in Wisconsin, the next state to hold a primary election, showed the president trailing badly. Johnson did not leave the White House to campaign. By this time Johnson had lost control of the Democratic Party, which was splitting into 4 factions, each of which generally disliked the other 3. The first consisted of Johnson and Humphrey, labor unions, and local party bosses, led by Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley. The second group consisted of students and intellectuals who were vociferously against the war and rallied behind McCarthy. The third group were Catholics, Hispanics, and African Americans, who rallied behind Robert Kennedy. The fourth group were traditionally segregationist white Southerners, who rallied behind George C. Wallace and the American Independent Party. Vietnam was one of many issues that splintered the party, and Johnson could see no way to win the war and no way to unite the party long enough for him to win re-election. In addition, although it was not made public at the time, Johnson became more worried about his failing health and was concerned that he might not live through another 4-year term. In 1967, he secretly commissioned an actuarial study that predicted he would die at 64. Therefore, at the end of a speech on March 31, 1968, he shocked the nation when he announced he would not run for re-election by concluding with the line, "I shall not seek, and I will not accept, the nomination of my party for another term as your president." The next day, his approval ratings increased from 36% to 49%. Historians have debated the factors that led to Johnson's surprise decision. Shesal says Johnson wanted out of the White House but also wanted vindication. When the indicators turned negative, he decided to leave. Gould says that Johnson had neglected the party, was hurting it by his Vietnam policies, and underestimated McCarthy's strength until the very last minute, when it was too late for Johnson to recover. Woods said Johnson realized he needed to leave in order for the nation to heal. Dallek says that Johnson had no further domestic goals, and realized that his personality had eroded his popularity. His health was not good, and he was preoccupied with the Kennedy campaign. His wife was pressing for his retirement and his base of support continued to shrink. Leaving the race would allow him to pose as a peacemaker. Bennett, however, says Johnson had been forced out of a re-election race in 1968 by outrage over his policy in Southeast Asia. After Robert Kennedy's assassination, Johnson rallied the party bosses and unions to give Humphrey the nomination at the 1968 Democratic National Convention. Personal correspondences between the president and some in the Republican Party suggested Johnson tacitly supported Nelson Rockefeller's campaign. He reportedly said that if Rockefeller became the Republican nominee, he would not campaign against him, and would not campaign for Humphrey. In what was termed the October Surprise, Johnson announced to the nation on October 31, 1968, that he had ordered a complete cessation of all air, naval, and artillery bombardment of North Vietnam, effective November 1, should the Hanoi government be willing to negotiate, and citing progress with the Paris peace talks. In the end, Democrats did not fully unite behind Humphrey, enabling Republican candidate Richard Nixon to win the election. Judicial appointments. Johnson appointed the following justices to the Supreme Court of the United States. Abe Fortas 1965. Thurgood Marshall 1967, the first African American. Johnson anticipated court challenges to his legislative measures in 1965, and thought it advantageous to have a mole in the Supreme Court who he thought could provide him with inside information, as he was able to get from the legislative branch. Abe Fortas in particular was the individual that Johnson thought could fill the bill. The opportunity arose when an opening occurred for ambassador to the UN. With Adlai Stevenson's death, Associate Justice Arthur Goldberg accepted Johnson's offer to transfer to the UN position. Johnson insisted on Fort.
Please subscribe and thanks for watching.